My name is Chesenia Burgos. My name is Chesenia Burgos, and I am the VP of Advocacy for our IIDA Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware chapter. And we are so excited to have partnered with Co-Creating Inclusion to bring you this 4-part series to talk about design, equity, and inclusion. And before I introduce our partners, I would like to thank our 2021 chapter benefactors, who I will now display on my screen. So without their generous support, we would not be able to offer all of you these valuable events that we do. So we thank them again so very much for allowing us to do so. Now it is with my great pleasure that I introduce tonight's presenters from Co-Creating Inclusion, Alethea, Cheng Fitzpatrick, and Pierette Imbriano. Thank you, ladies. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Chesenia, and thanks everyone. We're really excited to have you all here and early or on time. There may be additional people that join us as we go along. I'm going to share my screen again. For those of you that were here earlier, we had our poll going and our Padlet. We'll get back to that in just a minute. But yeah, we are here. This is our introductory talk on advocating for diversity and not just diversity, but equity and inclusion and creating long-term change within the design firm. And just a couple of sort of housekeeping things. As you heard, we are recording, so this recording will be made available to anyone that has registered for this talk. So welcome to the people that are catching up on the recording as well. And the recording will be made available through an email sign up for anyone. If after this talk you feel like you want to share it with colleagues or friends or other folks in the industry, you're welcome to do that. We'll give you a link and they can sign up to get the recording as well. So what we're going to be covering today, we've got an action-packed agenda and lots of Padlets. So just a warning, it will be fast-paced. It's going to be interactive. So the Padlet that you just had, we have like 6 more Padlets. So we're going to be asking you to think on your feet, respond to questions. Don't worry about doing it perfect. Don't worry about saying the wrong thing. It's all anonymous. Some of you may be here with team members, but the Padlets are all completely anonymous. So think of it as a chance to just brainstorm and voice some and sort of voice some of the things that you just come up with in immediate response to some of the prompts that we have. We may go through slides quickly, and part of the reason for that is we really want to spend time on the Padlets and reading out some of the comments and having discussions. We're a relatively small group today, so feel free also to unmute, to ask questions and to chat. We love talking with everyone and answer questions. So for that reason, we may go through the slides a little bit quickly, and part of that is because we do have the deck for you to download. So here, if you could put the link to that in the chat, and you can also use the QR code. So the deck is yours. You can keep it. You can go back. You can go back through it more slowly. So Pierre and I today were like, oh, like it's so much to fit in. What can we cut out? And it was really hard to feel like we wanted to cut anything out. So there's a lot of information that we want you to have, but we also don't want you to feel stressed out by the pace of things. So we just want everyone to be that it may feel a little fast paced, but it's okay. So this is a learning process, a growth process. If you feel a little overwhelmed, that's okay. It's part of the work. There's a lot to unpack around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we'll be talking a little bit about race and systemic racism. So these are all topics that, depending on your identity, but for everyone, for various reasons, can be difficult. So we hope everyone is well hydrated, or if you want to go grab some water, please do that. And so yes, so we're going to be going over really what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Those terms get thrown around a lot, and people don't necessarily know if they're even talking about the same thing. So we'll be spending time unpacking that. We'll also be talking about what oppression and inclusion look like in the design industry. We'll talk a little bit about getting buy-in to create long-term change. We know folks are really interested in hearing, like, how do we get leadership buy-in? And then we'll be wrapping up. So some community agreements, and if we had longer together, we might build these together, but we're just going to ask that you all listen closely to us, to yourself, and to each other, that you commit to yourself, your colleagues here, and your community to being as focused and present as possible. And we know it's the evening and we know people are still juggling lots of different things. So we know that may be not completely possible, but as focused as you can. We welcome that. We invite you to stay in curiosity. So if there's anything coming up that you start to feel maybe defensive about, to just be open and to sort of ask yourself why, or sort of just know, oh, that's interesting, the feelings that are coming up, and to have that growth mindset. And to speak from your own perspective. So everyone's experiences are valid, everyone's feelings are valid. We can all have very different experiences of the same thing. So we like to encourage people to speak from their own perspective and try not to speak for others or to tell others what they think or who they are. And we always talk about creating a circle and not a ladder. So a ladder is a hierarchical structure, and there are people on the top and there are people below. And there might be the thought like, oh, I'm going to reach down and help people up the ladder, or I want to invert the ladder. Instead, we like to invite you to create a circle, because with the circle, we're all in it together. No one's at the center. There's space for everyone. The circle can get bigger or smaller depending on how many people there are. And so it's really about making space for ourselves and for each other in this conversation. Having said all of that, we like to open up usually with a mindful minute, because again, these are all strategies for taking care of ourselves as we go through potentially difficult conversations. So for those of you who are on camera who might feel more comfortable doing this off camera, feel free to do that for a moment. And I know it's the end of a long day when you might have been, this might not be the first Zoom call you've been on today. So just like wiggle in your seat, or if you want to stand up, you can stand up. And just remind yourself that you have a body. I think sometimes we are so focused on what's going on in our minds, what's going on our screens, we forget that we have from the neck down, we have a body that's holding us up, that's supporting us. And so wiggle around in your seat, feel the weight of your body, feel the weight of your body in the chair or on your feet on the ground. If you want to gently close your eyes, you can do that. And I'm just going to invite you, one of the things we can do to calm our nervous systems is to slow down our breathing. And so we are going to take 3 slow, deep breaths together. If we could just mute if you are not muted, or maybe our co-hosts could help just mute the folks that are not muted right now. That would be great. So close your eyes, and we're going to take 3 deep breaths, slow breaths. Inhale through the nose, hold, and then exhale through your mouth. Okay, we're going to try and do it together, but if the pace feels uncomfortable, feel free to go at your own pace. So I'm going to invite you to inhale, hold, and exhale. Inhale, hold, and exhale. Inhale, hold, and exhale. And just take about 30 seconds to continue breathing at your own pace, and just focus on your breath. All right, and then let's come back together. So of course they're doing construction in my office this evening. So if you hear a little bit of background noise, I apologize for that. And that kind of a breath, it's a strategy that you can do at any time that you start to feel you're getting stressed, which does happen in these kinds of conversations. So I'm gonna hand over to Pierre to lead us just through quickly an introduction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome tonight. We're glad to see everyone here. And it was great that everyone came early and completed all that information for us. That's really great for us to know you before we even start. We wanted to start by talking about the reality of where we're at today. Everyone's kind of re-entering society, trying to go back to what is normal, which really also kind of means getting busy again and forgetting what we had the time to reflect on during the pandemic. And, you know, it's important to have this reflection and to think about the critical mass that was there, because right now, as things are kind of ramping up again, it's almost as if it was a fever dream, and it's almost as if it passed, like as if it never happened. And so I think for folks who really kind of were very conscious and aware, we're kind of trying to figure out how are we going to keep momentum going, and how are we going to continue working and trying to work with everything that's been happening and build in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So one of the things that, you know, we realize is kind of folks are really kind of very concerned, right, with everything that happened with Breonna Taylor, everything that happened with the onslaught and erosion of civil rights, and the rise in hate and Asian discrimination and LGBTQ anti-Semitism, Muslim bans. There's just been so much for people to digest and process that we really need to find a space where we can come together and process it together. So that's what we're hoping to do tonight. If we want to go to the next slide. So interior design is about creating a human-centered experience. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are interior design competencies. One of the things that we realized is that there is this real human-centered experience, right? And being able to create that, you have to understand where folks are coming from. You have to understand how to create this inclusive space where people are comfortable. One of the things, and I hope it's okay that I mentioned this, but I was saying to Alethea, in my house, none of us are interior designers, but we have like a real love for interior designers. And in a very kind of pop culture way, I completely admit, right? Like I can ask my 11-year-old right now to come in and tell me who is on HGTV. She could talk to you about Love It and List It all day. She can talk to you all day about, you know, about Queer Eye. Like she can tell you different strategies in terms of making your space convenient and comfortable. And she really equates it also to the sense of equity and the sense of belonging and the sense of inclusion. And I think this is something that, you know, people don't realize is a critical component to being, you know, an interior designer, but it's also a critical component to being a healthy person, right? We rely on you guys to kind of create the space where we feel comfortable and secure and safe. And so there's actually a real great appreciation, I would say, in kind of the regular daily lives of regular people for interior designers. So about us and what brings us to this work. Alethea, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So real quick, so I'm Alethea Cheng Fitzpatrick, she, her, hers. I identify as a British-born Chinese American. I now just come right out and say it. For 20 years, I was an architect in design firms in New York City and never talked about race once. So I think it's sort of, I want to acknowledge that it's not something that we typically talk about in the workplace, or certainly in the design industry. So I was born in London. I'm the immigrant daughter of immigrant parents. My father's family were political refugees out of China. He grew up in Hong Kong, so did my mother. And they went to the UK after they got married for my father to go to medical school, which I now realize is a very specific strategy for, you know, model minorities. Like there's a very specific strategy about who's allowed and sort of the elite that are allowed to come to the West to pursue professional degrees, which ends up perpetuating these kinds of dynamics. But I grew up in the UK in very white-dominated spaces. Came to New York City. So we'll talk about this more later. But the strategy that I grew up with is assimilation. So blend in, be as white as possible in order to be safe. I came to New York City when I was 18 years old. Fell in love, decided I was going to stay here. I really heaved a huge sigh of relief at the sort of lifting of the oppression that I hadn't even realized that I felt growing up in the UK. And I went to prep for architecture school and then went into a very white male dominated profession. But I'm a mom. I'm cisgender, heterosexual, married to a white man, living in Brooklyn. I have a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. And I really bring that sort of architect and designer mindset to the DEI work that we do. That we now do, where we are working with organizations to understand where they're at and what the culture is, what the needs are, and then where they want to get to. And where, as an architect and designer, we would then design spaces to create that culture transformation. Now, through our firm and our work, we work with people all the way through to create workshops and programs and policies and culture shift, culture transformation in that way. So that's me. Pierre, over to you.
Hi, I'm Pierette Imbriano, but I like for people to call me Pierre. My background is what brought me to this work because I had to kind of talk about it all the time. I identify as African American. My parents were African American. My grandparents are African American, although at my grandparent and my great-grandparent level, that's where there's some mixture. There's also some family that immigrated here from Ireland and Italy. And then also I have a grandfather who's Scotticook, which is Native American from Connecticut. So I grew up with like what I would call a very New York experience. However, we were, my grandparents came up during the Great Migration. They landed in New York, and we actually settled about maybe an hour north of Manhattan, in a very, very town, so small, it's not even called a town, it's called a hamlet. And we were one of the only Black families. And so that really informed a lot of my world. And then I moved on to college. Everyone knew my ethnicity in growing up, and it wasn't a question, and I embraced it fully, and I was able to kind of bring my full self and my family and be part of that. But then when I went on to college, there was a lot of confusion about my background. I had to kind of do a lot of explaining. And I realized I really started to understand how important it was to kind of talk about race and ethnicity and gender and all sorts of things. I went to an all-girls school, Bryn Mawr. I also did some time as a domestic semester abroad at Spelman, which is a historically Black college. And so, and then I moved on to kind of work in various different industries, and we don't have enough time to go into all that, but I do think it's important to mention that. And one thing I will say that is related to the work that you guys do is that I worked in affordable housing for a while. And one of the things that we really relied on interior designers to do is to kind of create this space for folks who really needed supportive housing. And it really made a huge difference in people's lives. And the process for doing that included the folks who were moving in there and their voices. And so I feel like I should share that because it was such a moving experience. And I feel like that really feeds into a lot of what we do today.
Thanks, Babe. So just quickly about the CSI methodology, some of this will come up, some of it won't, but what we really are going to be giving you today is a crash course in a power analysis. So a power analysis is the ability to understand how power is operating in any situation. And what we found is that ability to do that analysis, it was what can bridge from knowledge to action. So you need the knowledge to be able to do the analysis. But once you have the analysis, you can see the actions that you need to take in order to make decisions that are informed by diversity, equity, and inclusion, because what we're really talking about is power. We'll also talk a little bit more about anti-racism and today, and what that means in terms of taking an active rather than a passive stance. We won't really talk about restorative justice, but that's sort of the third pillar and what we do as well as a way of addressing harm and creating community accountability in organizations and companies. So we did the poll already, so I'm just going to share the results quickly. So I think you should all be able to just take a quick look and see that we have a pretty good range. We've got some folks from 100+ firm. I know there's a team here, so I don't know if you're all from the same bigger firm. That might be the case, but we've got a range of people at different levels of experience as well. And we've got some different titles. We've got a couple of principals, some interior designers, architects, some people with an associate or senior associate principal, someone in marketing, and a couple of other people as well. So that's good to just get a little bit of a read of the room. And then in terms of the Padlet that you all did, that was really great as we were waiting to start to just get to hear a little bit what some of your challenges are. One that really struck me was in a larger firm, lower level employee voices don't carry as far, and it leaves change in the hands of leadership. So I thought that was an interesting one. Pierre, was there one that jumped out at you? All of these are really great ones. They're ones that we hear. This one made me laugh. People thinking they're woke, but they're not. That is definitely something that we encounter. Pierre, how about you? What jumped out at you?
I think it was kind of a combination of things. I see that people really want to kind of move. They want to figure out how to move from critical thinking to action, which is something we see a lot. And we'll talk a little bit about. And then also, getting leadership to embrace what needs to be done. And we'll talk a little bit about that too.
Right. So feel free to come back to these Padlets afterwards to read, to add more thoughts if you like. Right now, we're going to keep going. As I said, this is fast paced. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is really about whether your people have what they need to do their best work. And people get sort of cagey about like, what do you mean by best work? I sort of think that some of the perfectionism in our industry can kind of kick in. So we really define best work as a zone within which you are doing work that both utilizes your potential, but also feels impactful and energizing. And I think what can end up happening, and I think as women of color, as people of color, we are often socialized to do work that we're good at, but that we don't necessarily find energizing or impactful. And that can very quickly lead to burnout. So I think it's really important to have both of those components. And DEI is really the critical work needed to support a company or organization in deepening the impact of its work in service of its mission. So a lot of people think still very much, even in sort of this field started out as diversity, and you'd have diversity offices, and then it was diversity and inclusion. Now it's diversity, equity, inclusion. Some people call it EDI. Some people now are using JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. There's like the acronyms keep getting longer and longer as we bring in new, as sort of new dimensions get brought in. But we really see it as something that really is quite broad and that needs to be integrated in every aspect of your business in order for you to be able to fulfill your mission. And so the language and the lens to understand and shift culture is really important, is what we're going to be talking about today. So what do these commonly used terms actually mean? This is really important because different people mean different things when they say diversity or equity or inclusion. And we're not necessarily here to tell you like this is the right definition. We're going to tell you how we define it. We're going to ask you to think about how you define it and how your organization defines it. And this, to have any conversation in your firms, this is a really important piece that needs to be done, because often there's confusion, because some people think, well, by diversity, well, you talk about race, you talk about gender, what do you talk about neurodiversity, what do you actually look at these different terms? So we want to know, what do they mean, how are they being defined and used at your firm, and then they can be used almost as a metric for understanding where there needs to be shifts in culture. And so we're going to talk about today is diversity, equity, inclusion, and intersectionality. So just at the high level, diversity, and these are not all the same thing, but just because you have one doesn't mean you have the others. So diversity is the presence of difference. Equity is everyone gets the supports they need to succeed. And inclusion is that people of all identities are welcomed and valued. And then intersectionality is an important one that you don't usually hear in the DEI, right? It's not represented in the DEI acronym, but intersectionality is about the overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage, right? So we're looking at not just women, but women of color or Black women. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these words, but understanding that many of us have multiple different identities, and that discrimination and privilege can sort of mitigate one another or compound upon one another. So we'll start out talking about diversity, and diversity can be many different things. But this is not necessarily meant to be all inclusive or all encompassing in terms of what kinds of things are on. Like, these are not all the different dimensions of diversity, and certainly different industries and different fields have unique aspects or unique dimensions of diversity that might be considered. But generally, it's not just race and gender, right? And at the core is personality. And so I'm actually a Myers-Briggs certified practitioner as well. So I'm really fascinated, things like introversion or extroversion, or big picture thinking versus concrete thinking, and the ways we basically intake information and make decisions and interact with people, energize how we plan our work. So right there are biases in our culture. I think Western culture is very extrovert friendly or very biased towards extroversion, for example. Different cultures might be more biased towards introversion or extroversion or other different aspects of personality. Then the internal things are the things that we often think about the most when we think about diversity. So there's race, there's age, there's national origin, ethnicity, physical and mental ability, there's gender, there's sexual orientation. These are things that typically are not things that we necessarily can change themselves. Whereas the external things, there might be a little bit more mobility, and that can also depend on privilege or lack of privilege. But things like socioeconomic status, education, geography, interests, appearances, beliefs, religion, relationship status, family structure, experience, those are all external things. Then when you're talking about firm culture, organizational diversity is really important too. And that's not just your role, your function, your seniority, your tenure, your department, whether you have a management status or title. For the bigger firms, it might be work location, right? There might be a headquarters or different offices that you'd want to make sure are represented if you were looking for diversity. And then era is really to do with, it's not just age, but it's sort of the events that influence us and influences in different ways, depending on sort of where in our lives we were at that time. So it's world events, historical events, cultural events, political events. I think technology is really interesting. Like, did you grow up? Did you have your first cell phone when you were 30 years old? Or did you have your first cell phone when you were, 3 years old? Things like that. And obviously, I think the impact of COVID and the pandemic and racial unrest, this round of sort of racial unrest or civil rights, compared to sort of civil rights in the 60s, like these are all defining moments in our lives. So our second Padlet, but our first Padlet in this series, we're going to have a Padlet for each of them. So then diversity becomes a metric that you can think about your firm. So at your firm, how is your firm doing diversity well? And what are the opportunities for growth with regards to diversity? So we do have this Padlet. I'm sure if you have the link to that, that would be great. You can also use the QR code. And so add your notes. And again, this is anonymous. And you can, if you would just write strength and give us your thoughts about the strengths, how your firm is doing diversity well, and then write growth. And what are the opportunities for growth with regards to diversity? And we're going to give you just a couple of minutes to give us your thoughts on that. So I see a couple of comments. If you want to write strength, and then how your firm is doing diversity well, and then growth, what are opportunities for growth, or you can just put it into one comment. Is everyone able to find the link? So I see a few comments. Would love to get a few more up. Does anyone want to unmute and talk about diversity? Oh, I see what happened here. You put the equity link in the.
Yeah, I just meant to do that for some reason. And give me 1 second. Let me try to pull this up from.
I was like, where is everybody?
I know. Let me try to pull this up from a different spot. My apologies.
Yeah, I have it. Hold on.
Here.
Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah. That
Yes.
should,
Sorry, everyone.
apologies, everyone.
We'll look at both. Oh, you could, yes. Okay. If you want to cut and paste and delete the comment on the wrong one, it should be on the diversity Padlets.
I'm happy to speak if
Yes, go ahead. Absolutely.
Okay. So, you know, I don't know if maybe I should drop off the call for the team to feel more comfortable speaking. I have a lot of my teammates on the call, and although we are a circle, you know, just given my role, and I would always encourage everybody to be comfortable and open, especially about this topic. But it's hard to have these conversations in general. And it's also hard to have these conversations with your coworkers. So I just wanted to open up by saying that this is a very new thing for us to do as a team. This is the first time that this team has even collectively been on anything like this. They might have done that on their own, but with me on the call, it's new. So my company does have a new initiative. It was certainly, you know, after last summer, we thought long and hard and, you know, about the situation, and we wanted to do something and have established a corporate social responsibility group and have organized into 3 pillars. And some people on this call are part of that. And I know my frustration with it is that we all have our full-time day jobs, right, of doing architecture and design and running businesses. And sometimes these other initiatives fall by the wayside. And it's not the intention for that to be the case, but unfortunately, I find sometimes things like that happen. So we have recently hired a diversity and inclusion director for my company, and this group doesn't know about that person yet. And I think that will be wonderful in terms of gaining momentum with my company and really making changes and making things happen for us.
Kimberly, and yeah, I mean, I think it's great for it isn't easy for teams are not used to having this conversation. These conversations are not always happening in the workplace. I think the design industry is actually, depending on the firm you're at, is a little bit behind something we work with a lot of nonprofit clients who've been doing this work longer, because equity is just a much more explicit thing in their missions. It doesn't mean that their cultures are any less hierarchical necessarily. But I encourage you to stay on the call. I encourage your team. And again, we do this with everyone as colleagues. We do this within companies. And so that's why we do create safety with anonymity and Padlets and things where things can be shared and you don't necessarily know exactly who's saying them. I should say also, anyone here is welcome to private message us if you want to send something private and that you don't want to go on a Padlet or for anyone to see, but to still sort of feel that you've been able to have a voice. So now we've got some of the comments on the Padlet, and I think, and I saw earlier in the challenges Padlet as well, I think it is really challenging. I think firms always immediately, when they think of diversity, equity, inclusion, they think of the diversity piece, and they really want to know how to hire people from more diverse backgrounds. And that can feel like tokenizing for people of color or for whatever groups you are looking to increase representation of, when you are also not doing the equity and inclusion things. It can feel like lip service. It can feel like the company is just doing it to make themselves look good. And so I think it can be confusing because first of all, leaders like, well, staff told us they want us to be more diverse, but now we're trying to be more diverse and we're told that we're tokenizing. So again, it really has to be an integrated approach where we look at where a company is looking at everything about their organization and making sure that the people from backgrounds that are not the majority are feeling welcome and included as well. I think we're going to keep, this is pretty fast paced, so I think we're going to keep moving on now that we've got everyone onto the same Padlet. But again, keep coming back and feel free to like and comment on these things. But we are going to talk about equity now. Here.
Hi, and this is me. And, you know, I just kind of want to say, Alexandra, we saw your comment in the chat and, you know, we smiled to ourselves. But, I think it's important to name this actually. While a lot of folks have seen this actually, and it's not the perfect analogy, we think it gets the point across, and there are people at different levels. And I think it's really important to name that there are people at different levels who have and have not seen this, who might not really understand the difference between equality and equity. We see this a lot. And so we feel that this is still a necessary slide actually, but we did smile when we saw that. So, just kind of go over the slide because it is important. Equity feels like oppression to those with privilege. And we'll explain that a little bit more, right? So you have what is equality, and equality is the assumption in that everyone benefits from the same supports, right? And so it's equal in treatment. And so if everyone gets the same thing, as you see in the first part of that slide, they're all standing on the, they all have the same, they're given the same size box, right? And so, but you see the results are very different, right? And so equity, everyone gets the supports they need. This is the concept of affirmative action that's providing equity, or different things that kind of really say like, we understand the nuances. We understand that different people need different things. And as you can see in that graphic, they have different supports to kind of get to the same level where they can see things the same way. And then there's liberation, where all three can see the game without the supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity was addressed, right? And so now you see the fence is gone. The systemic barrier has been removed. And so this is, it might seem a little trite, but it really is true. And a lot of folks really have a hard time understanding the nuances of what equality and equity are and how to bring people to a place of liberation. And so what we have seen though, is that folks who aren't receiving the same exact supports sometimes feel that equity feels like oppression to those who have privilege and have to give it up.
Or that they have privilege and so they don't need support. So I see this with my two kids. I have two kids, and the older one, the younger one needs a little bit more help with things. And the older one is always like, well, that's not fair. You didn't help me with that, or I didn't get that. And so that it's not fair, that people with privilege are seeing sort of like quote unquote handouts. And I hate that word, but that's the right, like that is how it's characterized. Well, I don't need that help. I didn't get that help. Why does this person need that help? The fact is that systemic barriers mean that some people are starting out with less and they face certain obstacles. And without that equity approach, what we've basically had is a default affirmative action program for white men for several centuries, right? Where white men were allowed to own land and we're allowed to accumulate wealth and we're allowed all of these privileges and we're given all of these privileges that other people were not. So
would you be able to give an example of what a fence would be like right now in the architecture and design industry for people?
I would say, for example, access to education, right? So to be able to afford to go to school, or to be able to go to school and not also be working full time to support yourself, to be able to focus on your studies and not be also taking care of family members, or commuting a long distance because you can only afford to go to an in-state school, or you need to live at home, right? So there are economic barriers that are, that correlate with other, that do correlate with race, because race was used to construct class. So it's a stereotype, so I don't want to say it, but it's an exact correlation. But what we know is in this country, race was used to construct classes. So we see disparities in terms of income across racial differences. And so that would be an example. Does that explain? Pierre, I don't know if you have one that you wanted to.
Sure. Another one kind of building on what Alethea was saying is that because people might have ideas of the education that people have, right? One of the things that jumped out at me on the Padlet was that there are firms that have diversity, but they don't have diversity in leadership, right? And so a lot of times the people who are invited into the room, or the people who are, brought to the table, aren't necessarily, the people that they feel are the most educated or have been, this is what we've heard. We've heard people say this, or they feel that, it's people who haven't had access to the same things. And so that lack of access has stopped them from being invited to the table, has stopped them from being brought into the room, has stopped them from having the voice that they should have in terms of decision-making and all sorts of things like that, that make the inclusive behavior for diversity to actually sustain itself.
It's a great question. There are a lot of different
Yeah,
answers.
great question.
We could spend the rest of today's talk just talking about those different things. So that could be a great discussion to have with your team as well, or for any of you to have with your teams going back into back to your offices. So anyway, it is time for the equity Padlet. So how is your firm? So I think some of these might be ones left over that would. Oh no, I'm looking at the diversity Padlet now. The equity Padlet. Okay, so the equity Padlet. How is your firm doing equity well? And what are the opportunities for growth with regards to equity? So the diversity one is a little bit easier to answer. I think it was maybe the easiest. If you haven't really thought about equity too much, it might be hard to think about this, but do your best. Remember, are different people getting the different kinds of supports that they need? Or is your firm really focused more on equality? What are the ways that different people are getting the supports that they need? And what are the opportunities for improvement? And try to think about how it can be very easy to just talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion altogether. So try and think really about the equity piece. We could focus another minute. Some great examples on here. So we're going to keep things moving pretty quickly. So if you're still writing, I know it's hard to write and listen while we stop to talk about these things, but as I said, it is fast paced. Equity, I believe we do a decent job spreading our internship opportunities to the surrounding schools. So that's a great example of looking at like who isn't getting access, who needs more help getting access to internship opportunities, and that would be an equity informed approach. I also see I believe my firm pays entry-level positions well. And I think that is really important because it's actually a privilege to be able to take a low salary, because you have to be able to have savings to supplement that. I think the equity piece would also be thinking about who needs the most access to those jobs. I think affinity groups is also a good way of thinking, like certain groups need more support because of the way that they're marginalized or that they're not the dominant identity within the workplace. So I think we're going to just keep moving. I know we have a couple more slides. This might help. Pierre, we're going to talk about universal design, which I know is something that interior designers are more familiar with. That might help shed light on the understanding of equity.
Sure. So universal design is the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. We see the need for this a lot. One of the things that Alethea often talks about is, and many parents have experienced as well, is in New York City, it's really hard to get around if you're disabled, if you're in a wheelchair, if you need a walker, if you have anything that has wheels. It's really, you have to know exactly which subway stops have elevators or escalators, if you can even view an escalator. And so understanding how to design something so that there is universal access is a real skill, and it's very challenging to do. And it's pretty necessary in order to kind of provide the equity that folks need, and also to create an inclusive environment. We even had some discussions with folks about kind of, when you're laying out design for your offices, how do you design for your offices? How do you design for getting into the office space? How do you design for the different places where you are once you're, the different clients that you have, and the different needs, and maybe the different needs that their families have. And so kind of understanding the bigger picture to all of it as well. So equity is often misinterpreted as one solution that has to work for everyone. And if it doesn't, then no one gets anything. Equity is sometimes weaponized as the reason people can't get what they need. Universal design means creating the multiple points of access, the multiple points of entry, the options and flexibility to meet a variety of needs. And everyone gets the support they need, just not necessarily the same support. And that's what equity is.
So I think it is really shifting your mindset to giving everyone the same thing, and it's shifting it to like, what are multiple solutions that meet multiple needs, and really thinking about those needs. So we're going to move on to inclusion, and I think it's really important that inclusion is not just about belonging. It's not just about like opening your doors but not shifting your culture. It really is also about people being recognized and valued for the uniqueness that they bring. And so I mentioned earlier that I was sort of socialized into assimilation as one of the only non-white faces in a room often when I was growing up. I learned to play down my identity, play down my uniqueness, blend in, be as white as possible in order to fit in and be safe. So that is actually, I had belonging, but I wasn't valued for my uniqueness. I didn't even feel comfortable being unique, and tried to play that down. So that's assimilation. Alternatively, sometimes people are celebrated for their uniqueness, and this often happens when we have cultural celebrations or Black History Month or Women's History Month. And there's not that there's anything, right? Those are valuable and needed. You could say that's equity in a way, because we have to have Black History Month, because otherwise Black history isn't integrated into curriculum all year round. But ideally, when we have liberation, you wouldn't need different months for particular kinds of history, because we would be studying all histories all the time. But often cultural celebrations, the uniqueness is valued, but there isn't that sense of belonging. So that's differentiation. Obviously, exclusion is when you don't have either. So inclusion, at least the way we define it, which is why it is important to talk about definitions, is that you have both the belonging and the sense of uniqueness, and that you're valued for your uniqueness. And the reason that inclusion matters is inclusion is what allows people to bring their real identity, thoughts, and feelings to bear on their work, such that their true self and their work will merge. And I think as designers of spaces, it's also thinking about what does an inclusive space look like that is going to allow the inhabitants of that space to feel that they can bring their real identity and thoughts and feelings to bear within the space. So we're talking, in this slide, we're talking about workplace and workplace culture, but I think it applies to the environments that you all are part of designing as well. So inclusion leads to increased engagement. So it's that sense of purpose and focused energy and flow, which leads to increased performance. So that's that sort of business case for DEI that we talk about, but it really does benefit everyone when people, right? If you think about the energy it takes to assimilate or to play down your identity or to fit in or to code switch, that's a huge cost. It's a huge effort that's going, that's really sort of getting in the way of just being able to do your work, right? So that's why you hear things about, you know, women and people of color having to work twice as hard just to achieve the same thing. It's often because of all of these kinds of barriers. And so we're going to do an inclusion Padlet. How is your firm doing inclusion well? And what are the opportunities for growth with regards to inclusion? Now, it may start to feel a little bit repetitive, but remember, each of these words is a little bit different, and having one doesn't mean that you have the other. So you can have diversity and you may not have equity, and you may not have inclusion. So how is your firm doing on inclusion? So Pierre, do you have the inclusion Padlet link? And as with this first comment, it's okay if you don't know. And it's okay if you don't think your firm is doing anything. So I think I see the question. I'm not sure what would be considered inclusion. I would think about, is your firm actively, what is your firm actively doing to let people know that they are valued for the uniqueness, that they belong, there's a place for them, and that their perspective is valued, even if it doesn't conform to the dominant narrative or the norm. So if you do think that uniqueness is valued in your firm culture, think about what, and it can, right, it's interesting because it might not be something that you're used to thinking about, but if you do think that do feel that uniqueness is valued, what are the things, because a firm might not be intentionally doing anything, but what are some of the things that are part of the culture that the firm is doing that makes that the case? So I'm seeing some things like voices are encouraged and listened to.
I really like that one. And being listened to and giving people the space to have their voice heard is a really important piece of inclusion. And that's something that we will talk about more in the workshops.
So yeah, so even thinking about how your office is planning for return to work, and are they asking people what they need? Are they gathering feedback? Are they responding to that feedback? Those are some of the things that can promote inclusion.
It's also great that that some firms celebrate the work and personal successes as well, right? Oftentimes people don't feel like they can talk about their personal life. I never did before CCI. Like never. I don't even think I talked about the fact that I had a kid. I mean, that's major, you know, and I don't think I really even mentioned it. And so being in a place where you can actually bring your full self to work and talk about those things is actually really great.
And then even think about how your projects are run. Are you gathering end user feedback? Are you talking with them about what their needs are? Are they participating in design reviews? That's how, right, those are some of the things that can create inclusion on project teams as well. So some of it is about, like we said, having that voice and being able to give that feedback. It doesn't mean that that you get everything you want, but knowing that you will be heard is part of inclusion, I think. think. And everyone defines it a little bit differently. So we always talk about focusing on needs and self-identified needs. So not assuming that we know what everyone else needs, but really asking people what they need.
Yeah, and I really love this one, Alethea. I feel very fortunate that project teams are very collaborative, excuse me. All voices are encouraged and listened. I mean, we mentioned that, but the collaboration I also think should be noted, because you can still listen to people, but not necessarily collaborate. And it takes a lot. That actually really is a thoughtful process, right? You have to build in time, you have to build in a lot in order to make collaboration work. And I think that's really important. And admittedly, I'm biased. I used to work in marketing. So, you know, it was, we would bring every voice from every department, from every angle in. And so, but I will tell you, we always had better products because of it.
All right, thanks everyone. We're gonna keep moving. Intersectionality, Pierre.
Yeah, so this one is one that we usually like to go into more. We're just going to touch on it briefly, and we will go into it more in the workshops. But intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, and gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or advantage or disadvantage. So this is basically, you know, when you have folks, and it was born out of, I'm sorry, Alethea, I can't help it. I want to be mindful of time, but really quickly, it was just kind of born out of the court case. Yeah, it was born out of this court case. And the court case basically was at GM. And there was a woman who was facing discrimination. And she was a Black woman. And they came back saying, like, well, we have Black people here and we have women here, so you must not be facing discrimination. And so basically intersectionality was born out of this legal argument that, you know, Black men are treated differently and Black and white women are treated differently, but there is this interconnected and overlapping interdependent system of discrimination when you're a Black woman that provides for a different level of discrimination when this intersection comes together.
Because when they looked at it, all of the women were white and all of the Black people were men. And so the Black women were, there's like a compounding discrimination and lack of representation for Black women. But if you just looked at race or you just looked at gender, it didn't appear that there was a disparity. So I think that is an important case to talk about.
Yeah.
So here is the Padlet for intersectionality. So this one might be the hardest one because you might not have thought about your firm in terms of intersectionality, and your firm might not be thinking about it at all. But I think it is often, right? What we often hear in design firms is that we've got really great gender diversity, but we don't necessarily have racial diversity. But is your gender diversity women of color? Probably not if you're saying we don't have good racial diversity, right? So diversity often is considered, right, is often white women. So you're really talking about a very specific aspect of gender diversity and not true gender diversity. So how is your firm doing intersectionality well? What are the opportunities for growth with regard to intersectionality? And again, it's okay if you feel like your firm isn't thinking about it at all. Yeah, so this is a really good one. Diversity is great, but as you go up in leadership, diversity is not bad. So often when you so that's why it's also important to take a nuanced look at diversity metrics. So when someone says we are X percentage people of color, that may sound very promising, but then when you look at it, it's more junior staff, or it's admin staff, or it's only in one department or one particular role. And so it can be deceiving if you're not taking an intersectional approach, or if you don't, or maybe it's more men who are people of color, or if you're not taking that intersectional approach and considering multiple different identities and how they overlap, you could be missing gaps. And I think really with all of these different systems of oppression are intertwined. So if you think about any issue, like even think about climate change, and what is the impact of climate change on low-income communities, or what are the relationships between gender equity and climate change? Like or gun control. These things are all interlinked, and all of these different systems kind of support each other. But we're trained to think of things in a very similar way. We have a larger percentage of Asian and Latinx community, and lower percentage of African American community. So I think that is definitely true. We've seen that. I think it's also important to think about how representation isn't the same thing as inclusion as well. So if you have representation, are those folks feeling included? And if they're not, people who come in with multiple dimensions of marginalization are going to feel even less included when they come in. And I see a comment here, my firm is somewhat diverse in age, gender, race, and sexuality. I came out after working there for several years and felt very comfortable and supported in doing so. So that's really great to hear. And I think that also looking at the LGBTQ community. So sometimes when we talk about race, people are like, well, what about sexual orientation? What about gender? And it's sort of like, don't forget people of color have a gender and they have sexual orientation. Or what are the Black LGBTQ folks feeling? And what are the trans Black women, what are the trans Black women feeling? What are the, right? And those different kinds of marginalizations are not going to look the same exactly. The way that Asian women get stereotyped is going to be different to the way that Black women get stereotyped, is going to be different to the way that white women get stereotyped. And so being able to understand and even just name and talk about those nuances is really important. So realizing women are being promoted, but it's primarily white women. So that is bringing that intersectional lens. Okay, some other good comments too. I think we're going to keep going so that we can get all of our get to all of our Padlets, because the next one is really interesting. So what do oppression and inclusion look like in design practice? And so keeping on time, so we're going to go through this a little bit quickly, but we do want to talking about race. And so race, we believe, it's not the only tool for constructing power and privilege in the US, but it is one of the primary tools for constructing power and privilege at a systemic and cultural level in the US. This is a country founded on enslavement, on genocide, on colonization, and those systems were very deliberately constructed to create things like class. So in other parts of the world, it might be gender, or it might be religion, or there may be a different dimension of power that is the primary one. But we believe that race is one of the primary tools, and that's why it's important that we have to talk about it. And we do have the Amend series is great. We do have some resources at the end, and one of them is a podcast called Seeing White, and it's a fantastic podcast because it literally kind of goes back through history. And often when we talk about race, we sort of immediately think, well, we're talking about people of color, and we find we have to remind white folks, you have a race too. You are also racialized. You are treated a particular way because of your race. It's just because it's the norm, it's often invisible. And the podcast Seeing White goes back and looks at particular moments of history where there were specific deliberate decisions made to treat people of color, especially those of African descent, differently to those who became, those who were considered white, and that those individual decisions then got written into laws and have been sort of deeply embedded into our culture and systems. So it's a really great podcast for revealing some of these things. And it's sort of one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it. So we feel that race is the key to unlocking all other systems of oppression and addressing many of the other issues that we care about. You know, I talked about climate change and gun control or patriarchy. I don't think patriarchy will be dismantled without also dismantling white supremacy. And when we talk about white supremacy, we're not just talking about the KKK and white nationalists, but we're really talking about the system that is the mainstream system in the United States that privileges white people over people of color. And so we are all socialized into these systems of power and privilege. It's not about being a good or bad person. We often say privilege is a fact. It's not something to feel guilty about. It's not something that you could necessarily control or just give up. Like the privilege, if you have skin color privilege, that's not necessarily something you could just tell people like, no, don't see me like that. Don't treat me like that. But it's really that those privileges give us an ease of access. And you know, it's a question of what are we going to do with that ease of access? How are we going to power share instead of power hoard? So again, really important to note that it's not about being a good or bad person. And so how to be an anti-racist, Kendi talks about a racist is one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. So I think we have in our collective psyche that being racist means using the N-word or using an epithet or being explicitly discriminatory. But the way Kendi defines it that I think is really important is that just by doing nothing, you are supporting a status quo and you're supporting a racist policy. So all of us are really complicit in these systems. We really can't help not be. Anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions, or they're expressing an anti-racist idea. So really when the status quo is racism and systemic oppression, inaction is itself racist. And again, I think one of the worst things you can accuse someone of being is racist. We have to sort of get used, but if we think being racist means that you're a bad person, then we are never going to be able to confront the different ways in which we are all supporting racist systems. And so it's important to get out of that good-bad binary and really think about it in terms of action or inaction, and to think about it at that systemic level. So, as I said, it's not about being a good or bad person.
So what is racist abuse? This is something that we find, and again, as Alethea mentioned, you know, we kind of have to get rid of the binary thought of this, but we do need to kind of look at how some of the policies interact with us. So how racist policies get perpetrated at the internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic levels. Can be internalized thoughts, interpersonal comments or behaviors, institutional policies, or the combination of systems that reinforce stereotypes, prejudices, and discrimination, and exclude, invalidate, negate, nullify, stereotype, or harm people. Racist abuse is defined by its impact and not the intent. And I think that's something really important to kind of focus on for a minute, is that, and let it sit and sink for a second, is that it's defined by the impact and not the intent. So you can have great intentions, but the way it lands for someone, the way it impacts someone's life is really the way it's going to be defined. So racist abuse, I do not use microaggression anymore. I detest the post-racial platform that supported its sudden popularity. I detest its component parts. Quote unquote micro and quote unquote aggression, a persistent daily low hum of racist abuse is not minor. I use the term abuse because aggression is not as exacting a term. Abuse accurately describes the action and its effect on people: distress, anger, worry, depression, anxiety, pain, fatigue, and even suicide. That is from Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, Chapter 4. And I think this really stood out to all of us because it's such an accurate description in a lot of ways, right? Microaggression kind of makes it seem like it's a lot of little things, right? But if you have, if you have many cuts, if it keeps cutting you over and over and over, right? It is this persistent daily low hum, and it really does affect people very, very tragically at times. Identifying racist abuse can be explicit or subtle, intentional or unintentional. It can be verbal or nonverbal. It can be action or inaction. It may seem small or go unnoticed by those that don't experience them on a regular basis. It can be positive stereotypes that are still harmful and may include inappropriate use of sarcasm or humor.
We've all heard that, like, oh, it was just a joke, right? And that can cut really deep.
So racist abuse within firm culture. We have pages and pages of these examples, but we're just going to read to you what comes up the most. And again, I know I've said this a couple of times, but we will get into this deeper in the workshops. But racist abuse within firm culture: feeling dismissed, devalued, ignored, being characterized as divisive or not a team player for raising issues, experiencing retaliation for speaking up, giving lip service to ideas without being willing to follow through, actions that are not aligned with intentions, and one term that we've all kind of come to know over time, which is gaslighting. And, again, these are just kind of like the top level summary, but, we've even seen in some of the Padlets, some things that people expressed, feeling like they're worried about retaliation, or feeling like, actions might not be followed through on. It doesn't, I want to say, like, it's not, again, we have to kind of think about what Alethea was saying, where we think about racist in a slightly different way, so that we don't kind of take it personally, and we don't take it, if we can't look at it in this different light, then it's really hard to understand these things that are happening in these behaviors that are experienced, but it's really necessary. Alethea, did you want to?
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, it's important that it is about impact. So I think we think of discrimination as treating someone differently, because of their identity, and that definitely is discrimination, and that is very harmful. But sometimes treating two people the same can have a disproportionate impact. And so we even said, like, an example that comes up is, everyone has to be in the office on Saturday, 8 a.m. for a meeting. That's going to be harder for some people. That has a bigger impact on some people. Maybe they live further away. Maybe they're working different jobs. Maybe they're a single mom with kids and don't want to push their kids. Right? The impact of that is different than on someone who has a lot more privileges. And gaslighting is really sort of making someone question their reality. So it's basically telling someone that they're not right, saying, oh, that's not racism, when you're not right, trying to tell someone what their reality is, instead of letting people self-identify. So we are gonna sort of ask you to consider every aspect of design practice. So, I won't read out all of these, but it really is a sort of lens to think about all aspects of design practice, from, design process, project types, from leadership, the college applicant pool, recruiting and hiring, but it's also career advancement, compensation, firm recognition, project funding, every aspect of practice. And we've already had a lot of these different aspects come up as well. And then I think the important thing to remember is it might not look like it's about race. And, one of those sort of things that people say that can be really frustrating is, why does it always have to be about race? And the thing is, in this country, because this country was used race as a premise for constructing power, a lot of what doesn't seem to be about race, if you dig deeper and you look beneath the layers, has at the systemic level a racial component. So a couple of things then to think about is the 4 levels of oppression. So the 4 levels of oppression are internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic. And they're really sort of the 4 levels of everything. And in this country, we're very socialized to think about the internalized and the interpersonal, when it's often the institutional or the systemic that is invisible. And as Pierre talked about earlier, in New York City, if you don't use a wheelchair, or you're not trying to navigate with a stroller, you don't even have to think about whether there's an elevator at a subway stop, or whether it's working or not. So those barriers, whereas for someone in a wheelchair, or someone who's with a stroller, or someone who's trying to navigate the city with a stroller can tell you, that becomes a really big part of your day, and that is invisible to everyone else. So the systemic and institutional are those barriers that some people are hitting up against, and other people are just sailing right on by. And so we want to share this framework with you. It's a document, it's a really great document called The Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture, which sounds kind of scary and off-putting. As I said, we're not talking about the KKK. We're really talking about a mainstream system that privileges white people over people of color, those that have been defined to be white over people of color. And Pierre, I'll let you just run through quickly where we've got about 15 minutes yet left. So I want to try and at least hit the 2 other Padlets that we have. But go ahead, just highlight a couple.
One, yeah, and thank you, Alethea, because she knows that this is one that I actually really like to kind of look at for a brief second at least. It's not the KKK, as she mentioned. It's really about behaviors we've been taught and we've internalized as good, right? And so I love this piece because it really is it's very sophisticated in that it helps you see what the behaviors are, and it actually gives you some sort of solutions to it, and it helps you actualize how to change things around. So oppressive behaviors. I'm just going to go down and name a few of these. Perfectionism is one that we've seen in some of the Padlets, right? And so having a growth mindset towards that sense of urgency, having realistic plans for that, right? And then there are other things, right? There's quantity, and then instead the inclusive behavior would be quality, right? Or fear of conflict, and the inclusive behavior would be truth telling and not avoiding conflict. Then there's objectivity, which is something that people always think is a really good thing, but actually empathy would be the more inclusive behavior. So there's so many more. I could go through all of these, and I usually like to, but I do want to be mindful of time. I do think we probably should continue on. The next thing that we have is another Padlet. So it's the characteristics of white supremacy Padlet. And so I think maybe, Alethea, what we should do is probably go back to that last slide so people can see the characteristics. But what we'll do is we'll drop the link into the chat. And if you can think about the characteristics of white supremacy culture, which ones show up the most at your firm, and pick the top 3 to like in the Padlet. And comment beneath each one that you choose on how it shows up.
So pick 3. The Padlet is pre-populated, so you don't need to add a note, but look at which upvote the 3 that you think show up the most. And then only on the ones that you upvote, leave a comment of an example of how it shows up. So pick your 3, and then you should be leaving 3 comments, 1 for each one that you liked.
Are you able to define what paternalism is?
Yes, so paternalism is kind of what we talked about before, is assuming that you know better than people what they need. So it's kind of that top-down decision making, rather than asking people what they need, sort of saying like, I know better than you do what you need. That's paternalism. Yeah, any other questions about what any of these mean? I think that probably is the one that's needs the most explanation. So any examples? If you want to add a comment, so I see quite a few votes. If you could leave a comment on how it shows up, what does that look like? So I see a few votes under sense of urgency, for example. So what's an example of how that plays out for our culture? Any comments? I see quite a few with 4 votes. The sense of urgency has 4, paternalism has 4, power hoarding has 4. And they're also interlinked. Does anyone have any examples of how one of these characteristics shows up? Power hoarding just jumped up.
Yeah, power hoarding jumped up.
Is anyone struck, or is there any other questions about what one of these might look like? So here, we'll give you some examples. So sense of urgency might be, unrealistic deadlines from clients, or low fees that require a lot of, working overtime because there's not enough time. Perfectionism might be constant red lines or sort of like minor sort of editing that doesn't really impact the overall. So people often push back on perfectionism and say, well, isn't that a good thing? And so a reminder is that quality is on the inclusive side of this. So it's not about sacrificing quality, but perfectionism, we're all humans, so perfectionism isn't possible. And so that can become the expectation of perfectionism can be harmful and oppressive. Whereas if you focus on quality rather than quantity, that's going to be more inclusive. Expectations of lower level employees staying late, lack of planning on your part is an emergency on my part. Yes, so we're seeing some comments here. It's in the handbook instead of having a discussion about something, the worship of the written word, right? Like that, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. Lack of conversations for top-down decisions. Yeah, so paternalism is often a lack of transparency. And so sometimes we found that decisions made with equity in mind, but still made in a way that isn't transparent and is still top-down, is still not actually really inclusive. People are not feeling included in those decisions, even if there was an intention, a good faith effort to consider equity in those decisions. Taking on too many projects for current amount of staff, so quality lessons, yes. Perfectionism, I think this is hard to avoid in our profession. I think it is. It's built into the culture. It starts in school. One right way, inflexity when problems arise. Yes, so there are some great ones here. So I think here, we're gonna keep moving. I'm seeing some great comments come on. We do have one, I think this is our last Padlet, which is, and I think we'll simplify this and just out of everything that has come up and everything that we've talked about, what are some actions or behaviors that you and at your firm, people could start, stop, or keep doing to counteract the sort of exclusion and oppression that we've talked about, and that would move towards equity and inclusion. So this is sort of like a little brainstorm, and start, stop, keep is a really good framework for being able to recognize, yes, we're doing some things well, we should keep doing them. Here are some things that we should start doing, and here are some things that we should stop doing. So let's see if everyone could just get one comment on there in terms of start, stop, keep. And if you do want to look at some of the things that are coming up, oh, hold on, let me just change it so that you can write. Sorry about that. If you want some ideas, you could go back to the previous Padlet and look at some of the, harms or some of the ways that the characteristics of white supremacy culture are perpetuated, and think about what behaviors would counteract those. And you can also, cheat sheet, look back at this slide and look at the inclusive, like the list of things on the right. So what are some things to start, stop, or keep doing to counteract some of these characteristics and instead work towards inclusion? And I should have mentioned, we will end at 7:30, but we can stay on a little bit if there are people who want to stay on and ask some questions. We've packed a lot in today, but I want to give everyone, I'm loving all of these comments. So I'm giving everyone time to brainstorm around the actions so that everyone has something they can take away with them.
You know, I'm gonna just kind of admit something to this group that I don't normally admit, but because it came up in the chat, I feel like I need to, in the spirit of transparency and full disclosure. Someone mentioned the series, the Netflix series Amend, and I feel like I should mention that my brother actually created that robe Imbriano. And so I am totally biased, but I highly recommend that folks watch it. It talks about the 14th Amendment, and it talks about equity from the positions of race and gender and immigration and LGBTQ. It has various different episodes, and it's also on YouTube now for free. So I normally never talk about it, Alethea, I can tell you, but because it came up, I feel like I need to be transparent about that.
We need to add it to our resources page. We have a resources page coming up, but we don't have we haven't put it on that yet, but we will. I'm loving these comments. Start realistic plans, power sharing, willingness to be uncomfortable, empathy for mental health and physical health. I mean, definitely after, you know, this marathon of a pandemic, mental health sick days, listening to all employees and coworkers openly. So really great things, creating visual plans to break down, like creating an open door policy, cross-level conversations. So again, feel free to come back. We'll leave these Padlets open. I'd like to scream this from the rooftops. No, it is really, I think it has really risen to the fore in terms of mental health. So yes, we'll leave these Padlets open. So feel free to come back if you want to take a little bit more time. We know this is fast paced. If you want to come back and take a little more time to read through them and to add your comments. And so we're just going to run through real quickly. So it's important to know that undoing white supremacy does not mean undoing white people. We're talking about a system and a culture that we're all socialized into. We're not talking about undoing white people. And we actually believe that white supremacy, it doesn't impact us all equally, but we do feel it impacts and harms all of us. And I certainly see that the way that patriarchy and white supremacy impact my husband, who is a white man. And so again, it's not, the harm is not equal, but I believe that we are all harmed by these systems. And so can you hold space for the multiple truths of different experiences? And one thing that is really important to me is that we are all inherently worthy, and we do not have to defend or prove our worth. And systems of oppression would have us, put us into defending or proving ourselves. For me, it's been really helpful as a red flag whenever I find myself falling into defending or proving. I like to say sometimes we do have to articulate our worth, but articulating our worth is a little bit different to defending or proving. And so we have a section on creating buy-in, getting buy-in to create long-term change. We're going to run through these super quickly. You have the slides, you can go back through them. But what we often see is there is this disconnect between leadership and staff, and leadership has good intentions that are not translating into results. Staff feels dismissed and devalued and unheard. And it can feel like screaming into the wind. I mean, that's screaming from the rooftops. It can feel like screaming from the wind. And so getting leadership buy-in is really about starting conversations, finding others who care about similar issues, finding an internal sponsor, and then gathering input, feedback, and data. And that is really, for us, data, we're talking about, yes, quantitative data, but also qualitative data. So it's some of that input and feedback that we've been talking about, listening to and harnessing voices from across the firm. And when you can do that in a systematic way, that is really how you can actually get leadership to listen. And I can tell you pretty much every organization that comes to us to talk about DEI work, it's usually not because leadership woke up one day and was like, oh, we got to do this, although that does happen. I know we've got some leaders here in this group who maybe are real change makers, but typically it's staff who have gathered together and have gone to leadership saying, we need this, like we need this company in order for us to do our best work. We need this company to be thinking about these things and that it is in the best interest of our company. And so to create long-term change, it really is about doing that sort of as designers, you know, how we do existing conditions. It's really about gathering data to understand the existing conditions, building the knowledge, brainstorming, strategizing, and then implementing. So it's really like that's kind of the trajectory. It's a very, very oversimplified in the time that we have. And there are different stages of organizational development. So knowing where you are in these different stages of development and that it is a journey and it takes time is really important as well. So we're going to wrap up. So we've covered a lot. A power analysis means bringing all of these different things. So we won't read this out. This is for you to take away with you and think about all of the things that we covered in this 90 minutes together that now you have. It doesn't mean we're fixed, you know, it doesn't mean we're done. And I know some of these concepts that maybe you may need more work with to understand, but you have a little crash course and an understanding of all of these different things that you can think about when you're looking at a situation. And some of our recommended resources. So in addition to Amend, I mentioned the Scene on Radio's Steve White podcast, How to Be an Anti-Racist and White Fragility. The Mask You Live In is not about race, but it's actually about the damaging effects of America's narrow definition of masculinity. It's a really great documentary. And then a couple PDFs that support some of the frameworks that we gave you today. And so we do, if you are like, all right, 791, we just touched, it's the tip of the iceberg. It really is the tip of the iceberg. We have a 2-part series, workshop series that we're doing with IIDA, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. And we'll be diving deeper into the implications for the design industry. We'll be talking about interpersonal communication skills, how to strategize and build momentum to get authentic buy-in from leadership, because we often hear, yeah, leadership says they're bought in, but it's a very check the box kind of attitude. So getting that authentic buy-in from leadership and preparing a roadmap for moving forward. We'll be going into all of those things. And the link is in the chat. This is our link that leads to the same link. It looks like a different link. It should be the same link. July 15th to July 22nd, we'll have a lot more time together, 3 hours. We'll take a half-hour break in the middle, but we'll do 2 3-hour workshops so that you can really kind of take the work and the conversation that we've started and go deeper. And we suggest that you advocate to your firms to send you to this, to pay for you to attend this workshop. And so we thank you and we would appreciate your feedback. We have a feedback survey. And so we're only a couple minutes late. We do like to do a mindful minute to close. And then, as I said, we can stay on a little bit to answer any questions if people want to stay on. It's sort of like the after, in the old days, if we were together, right, there would be drinks, or there would be like, as we're packing up, people would come and talk with us. So feel free to hang out a little bit. In the deck, by the way, we have a few slides that didn't quite make it into our main deck with a little bit more information, but let's just do our mindful minute close and then we can take any questions. So Pierre, you want to lead us out?
All right, everyone. So as Alethea mentioned, this is really a good way to recalibrate and to kind of just even use this tool like throughout your day, you know, to just kind of bring yourself to like a little level of peace when things are kind of running late and going crazy and, you know, you're trying to get it. So everyone, if you could just lift your shoulders up to your ears, push them all the way down to the ground, lift them up to your ears, hold them for a second. Push them all the way down to the ground. Roll them forward. Roll your shoulders back. Now just relax your shoulders. We're going to work on the head a little. We're going to take our heads. We're going to put our head forward. Lean our head back. Bring your head center. Bring your ear to your right shoulder. Bring your ear to your left shoulder. Roll your head to the front. Keep rolling your head slowly now over to your shoulder, the other shoulder. Roll your head slowly to the back. head slowly to the first shoulder. Roll your head down again. Let your head hang for a second. Lift your head up to the center again. Close your eyes. We're going to focus on our breathing for a few seconds. Breathe in. Hold your breath. Breathe out. Breathe in again. Hold your breath. Breathe out. Breathe in again. Hold your breath. Breathe out. We're going to take a couple seconds to focus on our breathing. Just breathe in and out at your own pace. Now take your whole body and make your whole body tense. Now relax your whole body. Shake it out. And open your eyes. We're back.
So everyone, if you have to drop, totally understand. If anyone has any questions or wants to chat for a few minutes, we are here.
Yeah, I have a question. Is there any way that you would advise people to prepare for the workshops? Any sort of readings or anything that can be done to make them get the best use of the time?
I don't think any preparation is necessary. I think that actually this workshop, it may be kind of like, because we know it was fast paced. So I think going through it, if you want to attend as a team with some other people from your company, maybe that weren't here, like having them also watch the recording of this that will be released and just work through some of these exercises. So maybe just doing a little bit more reflection on some of the things that we talked about here. Because again, I know we only gave you each like a minute or two to think about these things. So that would be the main thing. So there isn't any preparation required, but also the resources. So I think just seeing way, if you're not familiar with it, is really fantastic, and just looking at some of those would be another way. Yeah, but we love to have you.
Yeah. I don't know, Julianne, Yesenia, do you have anything you want to close out with? I mean, people are dropping quick.
Yes, I know. I wanted to go.
It's late.
Yes, it is.
No, just like a big thank you for both of you, Alethea and Pierre. That was a very enlightening introductory talk, and seems like everyone else felt the same. So thank you again so much. And then again, you guys mentioned the workshop series, so encourage everyone, hit the link and join us for a deeper dive in the coming weeks.
Yeah, and I think, Julianne, you offered if people want help talking to their firms about attending the workshop, you offered that as well. Oh, you're breaking up a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Not really.
There you go.
Kimberly, did you have a well, she works on it. Kimberly, thanks for attending with your team and for your questions. Do you have anything?
You broke up a little bit there. Can you say that again?
Oh, I said thank you for attending with your team and for your questions. Did you have anything else any other questions or?
I mean, I could probably talk for hours and hours with all my questions. So it's just the start of many conversations that we've already initiated, and my team has so much to learn and to do. And, for me, my team likes actionable items. So I don't want to just talk and have my other partners and principals just talk, and it's doing. and I like to do. So like finding, what are the small wins we can do, and then the medium wins, and then the long term, because it's going to take a period of time, right? This isn't all going to happen at
Yes,
once.
it's ongoing work. You're never sort of like, okay, we did all that, check, now we can move on to the next thing.
So for me, I know, people like to see actionable items. So I'm going to participate in the workshop, and that's what I was looking out for. Like, what can I initiate immediately? And then, because it's hard, and I've been in a position of hiring for 20 years. And, so I feel like I'm part of the problem, right? However, the candidates who, come in reflect the individuals who are attending architecture and design schools. So that's a problem, because we need to diversify students. And we have started going to schools last year to it was mostly for STEM education in underserved neighborhoods to teach people about architecture and engineering. And it's been, who knows if that's going to make a difference, right? But it's a start, like to start in middle school and get kids interested and knowledgeable about what architecture is and what it means, and that it's there for them. And then to continue to do it in high school. And, that's going to take time before that processes. And we do have a pipeline of a more diverse pool of people.
Yeah, I think
it's a long game.
It is a long game. I think the thing I would also say about that is, like I said, people always want to know about how to hire and how to be more diverse in hiring. And I think one of the ways to do that is to really work on the inclusion piece, and to actually genuinely be having these conversations to be able to talk about race and to talk about it genuinely within the workplace. Like, people can tell when they go to your website, people of color can tell when they go to a website, whether it's tokenism or whether it feels very surface or like lip service, or whether there's actually real work happening behind the doors. And so if all the work you're doing is in the hiring, and yes, it can be easy to say, well, we have a pipeline problem, but there are, like I think, yes, and right, yes, there's a pipeline problem, and part of that pipeline problem is also what people are looking at. Like, they're looking at these firms and they're going to the about page, and they're seeing a leadership team of white men. They're looking at these diversity statements that sound very hollow and don't show, like, we're doing this work, we're doing these readings. So we always hear, like, we want actions. So I would say one of the actions is to read some of these resources. Mm-hmm. And we tell our clients that. We just had a meeting actually with our clients today, and they were all like, what should we do? What actions? I'm like, well, you didn't do your homework. We asked, like, we gave you these readings. These readings are going to give you the ability to analyze power and see what can be done, like look at a situation and see what can be done differently, which is, you're right, like, you need the analysis in order to be able to identify the actions, and that you're not going to keep going to a diversity consultant to ask them how to do everything, that you're going to be able to make those decisions yourself. Like, you need that power analysis, and these resources are you don't need to do a whole graduate degree. You could do a whole graduate degree on it, but you don't need to. But just some of these resources will really change the way that you see things and the way that you think about things. And then all of a sudden you'll be like, oh, I know what, like, your team will no longer be saying, give me actions, what should we do, what actions should we take? They will know, and they will start to coming out themselves with actions. And things like the start, stop, keep are a really good way of quickly identifying actions as well. And I think thinking about near term, midterm, long term is helpful. I think the levels are helpful too. Like, what can I change internally? What can I change in my interpersonal interactions? What can I change in my team, in my department, in my office, in my firm? Right? You're not going to be able to make systemic changes right off the bat as the first thing. So it's sort of like each step leads to another step.
Yeah. You know what I find? It's a generational paradigm shift that has to happen. I'm a Gen Xer, and I feel like in between the boomers and the millennials, it's, we're kind of a hybrid, right, of the two. And the boomer generation, they're still running a lot of the architecture firms right now. And even though we're trying to like tell them we got this, right? There's a mentality that, I wouldn't necessarily say it's I'm not even going to define it, but you know, their generation, this conversation doesn't happen in the workplace. That happens on your own time, and the workplace is meant to be for work and not for social conversation. So
Right. And that's why people end up not feeling like they can bring their full selves to work. Right? There's that mentality of no, only your work self. So, Alexandra, I saw you kind of reacting to some of them. Did you want to jump in or have any other comments, or Julianne or anyone else?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to add that, you know, anyone who is, you know, having uncertain about how to approach their firm or their company to talk about this, that's something that we here at IIDA can absolutely help you, you know, draft an email, anything like that. Because this is something that's important, and part of the reason why we set up this workshop to be in this format. We're trying to make change in the individual firms, not just let's make a change in the whole industry, because you have to be more specific than that. And I feel like going to your actual workplace where you are, you know, 40 plus hours a week, hopefully just 40, you know, somewhere where you have to be, and you're feeling this, whether or not you're a person of color or someone who's, you know, systematically marginalized, you're still, you know, like you said, Alethea, with your husband, you know, everyone is still feeling this. So being able to go out and make that actionable change, which is what Kimberly's asking for, you know, this workshop is really going to allow us to do that. Give everyone, I kept saying in the Padlets, like, we need things to be measurable, because people, you know, say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and it'll be all great talk. But you can't tell that the action's there unless you can say that I'm going to set up this meeting. I'm going to, you know, have, you know, this kind of educational conference with our employees, or, you know, things like that. And I think that this workshop is really going to be able to help, you know, our members in our community impact their workplace. And then that'll just, you know, be, instead of, you know, 1 weak ripple from, you know, an IIDA talk, it'll be a lot of very strong ripples from all these different firms. And I think that that's just, you know, what's really going to make a difference.
And Julianne, you just said something that I really kind of want to highlight, which is, you know, in terms of what's measurable, also understanding that it's the meetings, right? And it's some of this work, like having, you know, Kimberly, you mentioned that so many folks from your firm actually came to this tonight, and that's actually something measurable, and that's something important that I always feel needs to be named when these things happen. Now, of course, there has to be a bridge moving from working through these things, going forward into actions. And Alethea, I can tell you, I'm a little obsessed with, you know, actualizing things myself. And so I have to slow myself down a lot of the time to kind of make sure that, you know, we go through the motions. I mean, the worst thing would be to hire people and then not have the retention, or, you know, to like hire folks and have there be something, you know, some sort of conflict that wasn't kind of thought about for unintended consequences beforehand. Not that you have to think forever, not that it has to take 6 months even, right? But just something that, you know, but just kind of learning how to think through those unintended consequences so that you can have that retention. That's actually a big actionable item, right? Like thinking those things through, working through those things, having these discussions. Alexandra mentioned in the chat, learning how to do the Padlets so you can have more Padlets, right? And then you can have more voices and you can have more interaction on a safe level. And then eventually you might not even need the Padlets as much, right? We're seeing that with some of our clients right now, is that a lot of them have moved past the Padlets. They don't even want the Padlets. They're finding that their folks want to actually just talk. And even some of our clients, you know, will have these workshops and then they ask us, how can they continue to meet up outside of it, and outside of our workshops, and what can they do in the interim? So, you know, it's important to understand how it's a constant progression and how it's something that's just going to constantly happen. I like to say it's like birthdays. Like, you know, I am at an age where I agonize over my age. I'm not gonna lie, like I agonize over it, right? Like I'm like, my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter today was like, you're halfway through your life. And I was like, geez, kid, thanks. And it's my own fault because on Facebook, I wrote that I was 85 and she saw it. So she's like, that means you're halfway through. And I was like, who's doing the math here, But I will say, I do think about my age throughout the year, and I don't think it's just kind of like what happens, right? And we all know that on our birthdays, we don't just wake up and suddenly have like a new revelation and a new life and a new year, right? But celebrating it is important. Celebrating that milestone and knowing that you're kind of at a new level is still important. So I really like the fact that, you guys are thinking about like what the actionable items are, and also thinking about kind of how some of the things we might take for granted as actionable items should be recognized as well.
Agree. The measurable items are super important because everything's been so overwhelming, and a lot, like in firms, like in our firm, we were one of the firms that like last year everything was happening and you had all these people posting black squares and this, that, and the third, and then creating these diversity groups, and it was like, okay, and then what? And it's like the Black and brown people are like, all right, well, we're all architects and designers. We're not trained diversity professionals, and people were wanting us to come up with solutions. And it just was like, I don't know. Then we're at the point like, okay, it's been this amount of time. Now what actually can we do? And part of it is creating those measurable items and having that kit of parts with those tools that people can actually implement. And then it's going to take time. It's not going to turn around. Kimberly, I absolutely agree. Pipeline is always going to be this thing that keeps coming up and we hit up against, but it's identifying people within your companies already who have been overlooked to become associates or who have been skipped over to be supported to go to NeoCon or to different trade shows. So there's like a little bit, the phrase, it's like a little often equals a lot. So it's like doing these little things even in ways where you don't realize it's so big, and then eventually things will come along. And then my last kind of comment with pipeline things, and there's so many organizations, there's ACE, there's Fresh Artists, there's just so many groups that are out here. We don't have to look at starting our own groups. It might be a matter of just tapping into some of those existing things and advocating on a small level. It might be a matter of just having conversations. I feel like I'm always advocating on small levels, because not so much now, but earlier in my career, or even when I was making decisions to go to college, because my family, which is predominantly a lot of educators, a lot of more traditional careers, they're like, oh, interior design, like, okay, sure, whatever that is. So a lot of it is just educating the people in your circles and the children in their circles and saying like, hey, do you know like what this is, and talking to them on a small level, and that can oftentimes turn into something greater, hopefully. So meeting yourself where you are at and trying to do what you can. But I agree that, and I'm happy that our chapter can provide this resource, because so many firms created the group, and like, that's it. You got a statement on your website, you got your black square on Instagram, but like it hasn't really gone outside of that. So I commend the firms that are supporting people, and I'm hoping there's going to be some FOMO and more people jump on board and want to back up the talk with the walk.
Yeah, if you want to upend a system, you have to go after the whole system. Doing one thing is not a new system. You have to think about all the way to the beginning where, when these kids are in elementary school and are getting asked what they want to be when they grow up, that's where the system begins. We have to, every step along the way, how do we rework it to better serve the entirety of the population who might be interested in this profession?
I think sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, it's not just the kids, it's the parents, it's making sure their parents understand, it's volunteering, it's going out and doing like the man of meals and things that aren't necessarily, oh, we're going to go like paint your room so you can understand how you could feel better, but it's just like having conversations with people and meeting people in communities. Because I mean, yeah, it is a cultural thing, it's a pipeline thing, but it doesn't mean like we can't infiltrate, and I'm just weird. I've known I wanted to do this since my parents are teachers. I wanted to be interior designer since I was 8. So it's like something that I have intentionally pursued. I went to high school for it. I went to undergrad. I went to grad school. I've been intentional about it. And I've just been fortunate to have parents had no idea. My dad still calls me an architect. I'm like, it's not architecture, like, but they were supportive, and that's not the case for everybody. So again, it's just more conversations, infiltration, and just representation.
Yeah, and I think that the pipeline is leaky all the way through, right? So it's not just what's coming into firms, but right, like, so I think, so like I said, it's yes, it's the pipeline coming into firms, but the pipeline is, right, you just see it, you just see the brain drain all the way through, all the way up into leadership levels. And so I think it's important to think about that. But like one of my pet, so you know, as a mom, and Pierre and I could talk about this forever, like one of my pet peeves is that boys need women as role models. White people need to see people of color as role models, right? We always are like, oh, girls need to see role models, or, you know, people of color. Like, yes, that's true, but we need our white boys, right, to be seeing Black women architects and Black women designers, so that they, as right, like we all need to be seeing that. So that's just a pet peeve of mine. And also I think it is the parents. I would get so frustrated, like you'd sign my kid up for Lego camp and it would be all boys, right? At 5 years old. That's the parents, right? That's the parents. That's not like, that's, you know, and it's the kids a little bit by that age, but that's, a lot of it does come from the parents. So anyway, I do have to go. Really great to chat a little bit more with all of you, and look forward to seeing you at the workshops.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Nice meeting you.
Thanks.